Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be taking you on this journey through the corridors of power in Indian democracy. Get ready to explore this fascinating world of the Indian Prime Minister. Now, whether you're a UPSC aspirant, gearing up for those tough exams, or just a curious citizen who wants to understand how things really work, this deep dive is for you. We're going beyond the textbook definitions, unpacking the real dynamics, the historical quirks, and the often overlooked nuances of this pivotal position.
That's right. We're going to shed light on those intriguing details that often get missed in the standard narratives. Get ready for some aha moments as we delve into the source material and uncover the intricacies of the Prime Minister's role.
And speaking of source material, our deep dive today is based on a detailed excerpt that really gets into the nitty-gritty of the Prime Minister's powers, functions, and relationships within the Indian government. One of the first things that struck me is how the appointment process isn't as straightforward as one might think. You'd expect a clear-cut procedure laid out in the Constitution, right? But all it says is that the President appoints the Prime Minister. That's it. No detailed instructions, no specific criteria. So how does it actually work in practice?
Well, that's where things get interesting. The actual process is shaped more by conventions and precedents than by rigid rules. In most cases, the president appoints the leader of the party with the majority in the Lok Sabha. But what happens when there's no clear majority? What we call a hung parliament. That's when the president's discretionary power comes into play.
Yes, those hung parliament scenarios. I remember reading about a fascinating historical example, the appointment of Charan Singh as prime minister back in 1979. The Janata Party government had collapsed, and he was leading a coalition, not a single majority party. It really highlights how the president's decision-making becomes crucial in such situations.
Absolutely, and this brings up another critical point. Let's say the president appoints someone who's not a member of parliament as the prime minister. What then? Well, the Supreme Court, in a 1997 ruling, clarified that such an appointee has a 6-month window to secure a seat in either House of Parliament. If they fail to do so within that time frame, their appointment becomes invalid.
That's a fascinating legal safeguard. And it contrasts sharply with some other parliamentary systems. For instance, in the UK, the Prime Minister absolutely has to be a member of the lower house.
Precisely. These differences highlight how parliamentary systems, while sharing some fundamental principles, can evolve in distinct ways, adapting to their unique political landscapes. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the oaths the Prime Minister takes upon assuming office. They pledge allegiance to the Constitution, of course, but also vow to uphold India's sovereignty and integrity.
Those oaths are often seen as mere formalities, but I think they carry a deeper significance, don't they? It's like a solemn affirmation of the immense responsibilities the Prime Minister shoulders.
Indeed. It goes beyond just reciting words. It's a public declaration of commitment to the nation and its people. Now, there's a phrase in the Constitution that often causes confusion, even among those who are quite familiar with Indian polity, the pleasure of the president. It essentially states that the Prime Minister holds office at the pleasure of the president. This has led some to believe that the president can dismiss the prime minister at will.
Yes, the pleasure of the president clause. It does sound a bit ambiguous, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So can the president really just remove the prime minister on a whim?
Not quite. That's where understanding the concept of parliamentary responsibility is crucial. The prime minister's position is fundamentally tied to the confidence of the Lok Sabha. As long as they enjoy the support of the majority in the lower house, the president cannot simply dismiss them.
So it's more about maintaining the trust of the elected representatives than simply pleasing the president.
Precisely. It underscores the democratic foundation of the prime minister's role. Now let's delve into some practicalities. You might be surprised to know that the prime minister's salary and those intriguing perks associated with the office are actually determined by the parliament.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not like they get to set their own compensation package. But let's move on to the core of our deep dive. The Prime Minister's actual powers and functions. Our source material breaks it down into 3 key areas: their relationship with the Council of Ministers, their interaction with the President, and their role within the Parliament.
Yeah.
Each of these facets offers valuable insights into how the Prime Minister operates within the framework of our democracy.
And it's in these interactions that the true nature and scope of the Prime Minister's power become evident. Let's start with the Council of Ministers. The Prime Minister acts as the linchpin of this body. They recommend individuals for ministerial positions to the president, allocate portfolios among ministers, and even have the authority to request a minister's resignation.
So the prime minister essentially shapes the composition and functioning of the entire council of ministers. That's a lot of influence. But it makes me wonder, what happens if the prime minister themselves resigns? Or, let's say, unexpectedly passes away? Does the entire government just grind to a halt?
Here's where it gets really intriguing. Unlike the resignation or demise of any other minister, the prime minister's departure triggers the automatic dissolution of the entire council of ministers. It's a fascinating constitutional mechanism. That creates an immediate vacuum at the highest level of executive power.
Wow. The stakes are incredibly high, aren't they?
Yeah.
That really puts into perspective the pivotal role the prime minister plays in maintaining the stability and continuity of the government.
Absolutely. And moving beyond the Council of Ministers, the Prime Minister also serves as the key advisor to the President, particularly on crucial appointments that have a profound impact on our democratic institutions. We're talking about positions like the Attorney General, the Chief Election Commissioner, and other high-ranking officials.
Right. Those appointments shape the very functioning of our democracy. And of course, we can't forget the prime minister's role in shaping foreign policy. They are, in many ways, the face of India on the global stage, representing our nation's interests and aspirations in the international arena. In fact, our source material even quotes Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, drawing a comparison between the Indian prime minister's role and that of the U.S. president.
It is indeed a compelling comparison. And it has sparked a lot of debate among political scientists over the years. Some view the Indian prime minister as the first among equals within the cabinet, while others describe them as the keystone of the cabinet arch. There's even a more dramatic analogy, likening the prime minister to a sun around which planets revolve.
Okay, that last one paints quite a powerful image. It makes you think about how India's system of governance might be evolving over time, perhaps moving toward what some scholars call a prime ministerial government.
It's a thought-provoking concept, isn't it? This idea suggests that the prime minister's role is becoming so central to the functioning of the government that it overshadows the traditional balance of power within the cabinet, and even vis-a-vis the president.
So we're seeing a potential shift in the dynamics of power. But not everyone necessarily agrees on where it's headed, or whether it's a positive development.
Exactly, and that's where critical thinking comes in, particularly for our UPSC aspirants who need to go beyond simply memorizing facts. It's about analyzing different perspectives, understanding the nuances, and forming your own well-reasoned conclusions.
And speaking of those nuances, here's a fun fact that our source material highlights. Did you know that 6 chief ministers have gone on to become prime ministers of India? It's like a fascinating pathway from leading a state to leading the entire nation.
It certainly highlights the diverse paths to national leadership in our country. But coming back to this evolving relationship between the president and the prime minister, the Constitution does lay out some key articles that define their interactions. And understanding these articles is crucial for grasping the intricacies of how power is distributed and exercised at the highest levels of government. You know, this trend of chief ministers rising to the prime minister's office. It's fascinating. It tells us something about the dynamics of power in our federal system. Do you think it strengthens the connection between states and the central government?
That's a great question. It definitely suggests a strong link between state-level experience and national leadership. Having that firsthand understanding of the challenges and aspirations of different states must be invaluable for a prime minister. But let's dive into those constitutional articles that outline the president-prime minister relationship. I think Article 74 is a good place to start. It basically states that the president should act on the advice of the Council of Ministers, headed by the prime minister. So even though the president holds a lot of symbolic power, they're bound to follow the PM's lead, right?
In most cases, yes. Article 74 is essentially the cornerstone of the relationship between the president and the prime minister. It establishes the principle that the president, while holding significant symbolic power, is bound to act on the advice of the Council of Ministers, which is headed by, you guessed it, the prime minister. But, and this is where it gets interesting for our UPSC aspirants, there's a fascinating caveat. The president can actually ask the Council of Ministers to reconsider their advice.
Oh, so it's not a completely one-sided relationship. The president has some room to push back, at least to make the Council of Ministers think twice. That adds another layer of complexity to the dynamics, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It highlights the checks and balances built into our system. And then we have Article 75, which lays out the appointment process for ministers. It reiterates that the president appoints them, but only on the prime minister's advice. It also clarifies that ministers serve at the pleasure of the president. Now, does that phrase ring a bell?
Wait a minute, haven't we heard that before? Didn't we talk about the pleasure of the president clause earlier and debunk the idea that the president can just dismiss anyone they want?